York, our local chapter for the American Research Center in Egypt, for their financial support and for supporting this very important discussion we're having today about decolonizing and rethinking our approaches to the field of Egyptology. So for those of you who don't know about ARCE, ARCE is a private non-profit organization that supports research on all aspects of Egyptian history and culture. So one of the goals of ARCE is to strengthen American Egyptian cultural ties through grants, fieldwork, and field schools. ARCE provides fellowships, funding, opportunities to scholars, students, and educational cultural institutions to foster education, learning, and cultural heritage and preservation. So ARCE has local chapters throughout the country, which sponsors events, lectures, and discussions such as the one that we are having today. So if you want to know more about ARCE and for a calendar of future ARCE New York lectures, which will be held virtually, please visit arceny.org, or arceny.org. And if you're learning, or if you're interested in learning more about ARCE or becoming a member of ARCE, please visit www.arce.org. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this virtual panel where we're going to be discussing these issues about decolonizing Egyptology and how to rethink the way that we have studied Egyptian culture and civilization. And today we have four very distinguished speakers who will talk about their current work and research in addressing these past issues about decolonization and transforming the field into one that is inclusive and that reevaluates our past actions. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have each speaker present for about 10 minutes. I'll introduce each one. After all the four speakers have finished, we'll open up the floor for discussion and then also take questions from the audience. So our first speaker for today will be Elizabeth Miner, who received her doctorate at UC Berkeley. She's currently directs a field project in Massachusetts and co-directs a field project in the Northern Dongola Reach in Sudan with Sarah Skellinger. Her 18 years of museum work includes educational outreach, registration, development, and digital imaging projects. She first visited a museum basement as a child and wanted to stay there forever, and now prioritizes sharing the important stories that can be told through global collections and hearing new perspectives from museum visitors. So she will be presenting on decolonizing the practice of archaeology in Sudan, confronting biased legacies, and developing collaborative relationships. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Let me get my slides shared. Okay, can everyone see them?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of archaeology in Sudan, specifically looking at the site of Kerma and the Kerma culture, which is the main focus of my research. And then I'm going to share mostly resources and other places to look for understanding how the practice of archaeology in Sudan is changing today and in the recent past. I'm not going to try to be able to cover all of the important work that many people are doing in Sudan and in Egypt. I can't cover all of that in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try to direct you to resources and give you a set of questions to start thinking about how in your own research practices you can engage with these important issues. And there is a list of resources that all of the panelists have contributed to that you can find at this link, and I believe it's also going to be put in the chat. Again, we have tried to put in important resources and we might have missed things. You can send us suggestions if you have them, and know this is a living document. We hope to keep on adding to it. So the first thing I want to do is to circle back and talk about the construction of Nubian studies first, especially the foundation of the cultural sequence determined by the American archaeologist George Reisner. His work in the first half of the 1900s focused on major religious and political capital sites, especially Kerma, El Kuru, Nuri, Merowe, and Jebel Barkal. It's important to acknowledge that in Reisner's work at Kerma in particular, he worked through a biased and doubly colonialist lens. Okay. Sorry, this is a slightly different format than I use when I'm lecturing. Here we go. All right. He approached the material culture and cultural practices found at Kerma through an Egyptocentric approach, where he explained the highly complex architecture and artisanry at the site as the result of ancient Egyptian colonization, which we know now had not occurred at that period. He put primacy on Egypt as a complex civilization, which of course it was, but he saw that as the sole primary driver for cultural achievement of the ancient Sudanese of the Kermans. And then this was compounded by racist and misogynistic biases that further denied the possibility of social complexity in this ancient African civilization. And I especially want to direct you to the recent lecture given by Stuart Tyson Smith that's just available, I believe, as of yesterday on the Hutchins Center's YouTube channel, where he addresses this topic in both Egyptology and Nubiology in great detail. Again, we only have 10 minutes here today. I also won't quote from Reisner directly today, but you can find his Kerma excavation report on Hathi Trust. And if you use this shortened URL here, you can see kind of the primary example, again, of how he approached this material through a racist lens in terms of the Africanness of the Kermans. And you can look for any kind of bias you want to, especially misogynistic, and looking at the role of ancient Nubian women in what he saw as patterns of violence in terms of sacrifice. You don't have to look far to find fairly blatant and egregious examples of this language and interpretation, both with Reisner and with other archaeologists studying at this time. An exercise that I do with my own students when we're talking about the history of archaeology in general is I have them look at these primary sources and highlight the terms that they see as biased and judgmental. And you can see a rainbow of colors on the page as you're going through. The way that facts are presented are very much colored by these biases that scholars had at that time. For Sudan, from the 1960s onwards, at Kerma, Charles Bonnet's excavations brought the full complexity of the site to light. Reisner's cultural sequence could actually be flipped. What he had seen as a de-evolution of Egyptian culture into localized forms is instead a several thousand-year-long development of stunningly unique artistic traditions. But it's important to keep this highly problematic early interpretation in mind as future research brings in new questions and new voices and understandings of ancient Sudan. It's very important to think about community archaeology in Sudan today, along with long-established informal community relationships. A significant amount of current archaeological projects in Sudan incorporate community engagement as an integral part of their research activities. Some responses in the past have been that, from academia in particular, have been that communities in Sudan are not interested in ancient cultural heritage, and that's not the case in any way. In fact, in my own experience, I found it's almost impossible to not have community involvement in Sudan. Sudanese people are extremely proud of their hospitality and their heritage, and are very welcoming of travelers and archaeologists, not in every case, but in my personal experience, definitely. Here are a few examples of community archaeology in Sudan that I want to alert you to, especially in an upcoming workshop, the practices of community engagement in Egypt and Sudan through the EES. A few articles that talk about very interesting examples of community-based practices in Sudan, especially James Humphreys and Rebecca Bradshaw's work at Merowe, with community events where they showcase experimental archaeology of the iron smelting that they're studying there. Claudia Nazar's work with Mograt Island, Tomomi Fushia's excellent work at Amara West, and also a new project in Old Dongola, It's very much integrating interviews with people, understanding their priorities and their interpretations of the past, along with their ethnographic and archaeological work. Other projects that are long established, such as Tombos, and Brenda Baker's work at Ginefab and Jeff Amberling at El Koru integrate community outreach in elementary schools, sharing the results of their research with the community that's adjacent to the sites. And there's interesting new work in terms of museums as well. There's an ICROM and NCAM Western Sudan Community Museums Initiative. There's more information again at this link. So as we work as Egyptologists or archaeologists, I currently am in an anthropology department working in Sudan, so I can't speak to traditional archaeologists necessarily. It's important to think about what questions you're asking and why you're asking those questions. Are they rooted in the history of the discipline and the perspectives from the past, or are they forward thinking? Who is asking those questions? Why those people in particular are setting that research agenda? And what gatekeeping practices are keeping the discipline from growing and why? Specifically, it's important to think about how your research practices can be inclusive and not exploitative as they have been in the past of the discipline. Which again, I think this discussion is happening, but I want to highlight these questions. In terms of what the research questions are, it's also important to think about not if, but how these topics are addressed. How were relationships along the Nile Valley developed and negotiated? What are the social, religious, economic, and artistic connections between the Nile Valley and adjoining regions in Africa? And how do your research questions fit into larger discussions and understandings of Africa? Not if, but how. And then in terms of audiences and research outcome, who are the audiences for your research outside of the traditional confines of Egyptology? Are there programs or initiatives already working on these issues, and how can you support them or speak with them to see how you could fit into their existing program? And who will fund this type of work? So I'm going to wrap up with an example of a new project that my team and I are working on in the Northern Dongola Reach area. There's myself and Sarah Scalinger, who are the co-directors. We're also working with kind of a side project, Christopher Sfara, who's a landscape archaeologist, and then also with Sudanese archaeologists through the National Corporation of Antiquities and Museums, Ahmed Sokri and Saida Ahmed. This was our first field season in January in 2020. And one of the goals, along with recording the site and getting the project started, was to build relationships with the community in the area, especially with Stuart Tyson Smith's work in Sudan and looking at relationships with Egypt. We talk about entanglement between ancient peoples, but it's important to know it's not just for ancient communities, it's for us working as archaeologists today. As I mentioned earlier, the practice of archaeology in Sudan is full of important examples of researchers working in cooperation and in collaboration with local communities. So here at R4 on the top left, you can see the research team and community members, Tariq, who's one of the family representatives from the area nearby, Ahmed Sokri, who's the inspector and archaeologist from NCAM we were working with, Christopher Savara, myself. Sarah Scalinger was not able to join on this trip, Salim Mohammed, who's our operations manager, and Abdelghada Farah, who's one of the community members, again, from the direct region. Especially the Farah family were very welcoming and helped us build those connections with the community through both informal and formal meetings. So on the bottom left is our first community meeting. It was attended by women and children as well. They didn't want to be pictured to be shown for presentations. But what we did was describe the process we were going through, the material that we're using and the equipment. In particular, the kids were really interested to know why we'd been putting these bright flags all over the place when we were flagging out the outlines of loci and find spots. and asked them for input in terms of what our research priorities should be and how they wanted to learn about the outcomes. Any of you who have been able to travel to Sudan, you know about the amazing food that's there, and that's something that the community wanted us to tell people about when we spoke about the project. And then on the bottom right, Christopher Savara is talking with folks who were around when we were doing drone mapping in terms of, again, being transparent about our research process and especially the equipment that we were using. We asked them to rank which of our current research questions they were the most interested in. I found that in the past, if you just ask, what are you interested in? People say everything, whatever you want to know. So it was good to have a little bit of structure to begin with. And we found that community members were especially interested in learning about the ancient climate and environment and regional connections. In terms of their current life and practices, the agriculture is aquifer based. They're pumping up water from underground and they're having a lot of salinization issues. And also they're combating their own climate change that's happening today. And in the past, this Kerma period settlement was experiencing climate change and declining water resources also. So it was interesting to see this connection between today and the past, and they're very interested. Our research can help inform how they live today. The men wanted pamphlets every year from us to report back on our research. The women really wanted a video that was shown for everyone to come, like a movie theater style community event. And we agreed we could do that every few years instead of every year because it would be kind of a production. And then we asked what they would want international audiences like you to know about their community. They said, what you see with your own eyes, please report back about us. The women wanted people to know about their traditional ways of dress and food and hospitality in particular. And again, we wanted this to be a conversation. We opened up the lines of input and let them know, like, we wanted to hear from them in the future too. And also, specifically, they wanted me to show this picture with Ali Farah. This was the first day on the site, and we found 3 potsherds that fit together, and everyone was very excited for the beginning of the project. On our end, we're also having a conversation about how to incorporate this community input as primary data in our work. We're developing a database model to build videos and interviews into landscape, loci, and object records as well. So it's not sort of a side thing that happens, it's fully integrated into the project. A quick acknowledgements and thank you to the people who've helped make this project happen and funded it. And then again, a link to resources that the other panelists will be talking about as well. And I just want to leave you with this question of how can you support this repositioning work or decolonization work? Again, I'm not doing it perfectly. This is a learning experience for me as well. For you as audience members, think about asking your local museum about their community programming. As members of public audiences, let institutions and broadcasters know that you want to hear more inclusive voices about new topics. And also please consider becoming a member of the American Sudanese Archaeological Research Center, AMSARC, and also see the list of our other fundraising programs that, again, we'd love to add to. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It sounds like you're all doing such wonderful work there. So let's move to our next speaker, Solange Ashby, who received her PhD in Egyptology with a specialization in ancient Egyptian language and Nubian religion from the University of Chicago. She has researched in Egypt at the Temple of Philae and participated in an archaeological excavation in El Kuru, Sudan, the Royal Kushite Cemetery. Her first book, Calling Out to Isis, The Enduring Nubian Presence at Philae, is published by Gorgias Press. Her current research explores the roles of women in traditional Nubian religious practices. Dr. Ashby is working on the first monograph dedicated to the history, religious symbolism, and political power of the queens of Kush. And so her presentation is aptly titled, Respect Nubia. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that warm welcome. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation about repositioning Egyptologies. And to that end, I will focus on respecting Nubia. And so I will encourage folks who are Egyptologists and those who love the study of ancient Northeast Africa to go beyond Egyptian exceptionalism, to begin to consider Nubia and Egypt as part of a larger Nile Valley civilization that stretches from Rwanda at the headwaters of the White Nile through Nyanza, Lake Victoria to Khartoum. Also from Lake Tana through eastern Sudan on the Abyei, the Blue Nile, and from the Ethiopian highlands through the homeland of the Agao people, down the Takazi River into the Gash Delta lands of the Nara, to the Atbara River that is named for them. We should incorporate the study of Nubia into a larger study of the Nile Valley civilization that, of course, encompasses all of East Africa. And to this end, I'll read a slightly long quote from Christopher Ehret, because I think it sums this up very well. Quote, "Because of the dominant Western idea of Egyptian exceptionalism, historians have long identified Egypt as the early locus of this transition from small towns to early kingdoms in the African continent. What they have generally failed to recognize is that the formative area of ancient Egyptian culture, southern Upper Egypt, was the northern outlier of a wider African nexus of emerging political complexity. The heartland of this influential new zone of cultural exchange between African civilizations lay in the northern Middle Nile Basin, among peoples of the Sudanic civilization. Strikingly, the earliest evidence of new political and ritual complexity in the 5th millennium BCE appeared among the inhabitants of Nabta Playa, in existence centuries before similar features turned up in Upper Egypt. And this quote comes from his book called The Civilizations of Africa, published about 3 or 4 years ago. And you can find that on page 91. The pertinent point, of course, that Professor Ehret was making is that this entire area is more profitably understood as a unit of multiple ethnicities, migratory people interacting throughout all of history. And in order to understand Egypt well, we need also to understand what is happening in Nubia. So I will just highlight 3 points to say what I would like to about respecting Nubia. And those will center on the headings Know Nubia, Teach Nubia, Respect Nubia. So to know Nubia, we might begin by studying the languages of this region: Meroitic, Nara, or Old Nubian. We could learn more about the religious traditions and cultural practices of the people who lived in Nubia in the Middle Nile Valley, the A group people, C group, and Blemmyes, as well as those people resident in the Eastern Desert and up into the highlands of Ethiopia, such as the Agao and Nara people in Eritrea and northern Ethiopia. We can expand our understanding of this history by reading Black scholars, such as Sheikh Anta Diop, W.E.B. Du Bois, and William Leo Hansberry. This broader set of research questions and findings will help us to understand Nubia in its larger East African context. To teach Nubia is very simple, just to simply begin offering classes on Nubia in Egyptology programs. When I got my doctorate, I didn't receive one single course on ancient Nubia. Nubians were only presented as the oppressed people of Egyptian who felt the heel of Egypt's colonial rule for 500 years. So integrate standalone courses on Nubia into doctoral programs in Egyptology. Further, museums that have a wealth of Nubian artifacts need to bring those out of the basement and put them onto display. Museums such as the Penn Museum or University of Chicago's Oriental Institute or the Museum of Fine Arts, these three places and several others have amazing collections of Nubian artifacts that are just hidden away in museum basements. By putting these objects on display, the larger public will become aware of Nubia as another important ancient African civilization. And then also cite Black women. So if you're not familiar with this hashtag on Twitter, you can go and look there. And in that vein, I would like to just say the name of some amazing Black women scholars that I've had the honor to work with. So I will highlight Shayla Monroe, a zoo archaeologist who's currently writing her dissertation at University of California, Santa Barbara, where she's working with Stuart Tyson Smith. Deborah Hurd, a Nubian archaeologist and anthropologist who studied with me at University of Chicago and is finishing up her dissertation. Anissa Malvosin, an Egyptologist working on her doctorate at University of Toronto. Iman Nagy, who focuses on Egyptian and Ethiopian archaeological and indigenous studies at UCLA. And then a shout out to a scholar in the field who is at the Louvre, Aminata Sako Austier. So then to wrap up, the third point, to honor Nubia. And this brings us into the modern era. And I would like to urge that the Egyptian government bring into practice Egypt's right of return for the Nubian people. Egypt's current president pledged in his 2014 election campaign to help Nubians who were displaced by the flooding of Nubia to return to their traditional lands. Article 236 of the 2014 Egyptian Constitution stipulates that authorities must allow Nubians to return to their traditional lands bordering along the Nile or Lake Nasser within 10 years, within 10 years. And so that time is running out shortly. And we should see progress on Nubians being allowed back to their traditional lands. And then finally, fund programs that work toward language acquisition for Nubians in the diaspora. This generation of Nubians growing up outside of their traditional communities are not all learning their native languages, which means Nubian languages are endangered. Matoki, Nobin, Andandi, Mido, Bergid, and the Ajang languages of the Kordofan Hills. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Solange. That was a really interesting presentation. I look forward to talking about it more. Our next speaker is Vanessa Davies, who received her PhD in Egyptology from the University of Chicago. She is the author of Peace in Egypt, the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Egyptian Epigraphy and Paleography, and the editor of a forthcoming volume, A Material Excavated from Naga Ed Deir. Vanessa is currently writing a book on the contributions of scholars of African descent in the US to the disciplinary histories of Egyptology and Nubiology. So her presentation is, quote, "The evidence is with the Ethiopians," end quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'd like to talk to you all today about my research. I'm working on the disciplinary history of Egyptology and Nubiology, and you're probably aware of the fact that the way that that disciplinary history is currently written, it's composed primarily of white people, mostly men from Europe and the US. And I want to correct that, because all of these people you see on my slide are all part of the disciplinary history. They wrote about ancient Egyptians and ancient Ethiopians, which is the way that they referred to the people of modern Sudan and southern Egypt. Now, my project starts in 1900, but I want to make it clear that there was a history of people of African descent in America engaging with these ancient cultures long before 1900. The reason my project starts in 1900 is because that's when Egyptology first became part of the university curriculum in the US. So I am tracing conversations that the people you see here had with white Egyptologists in universities and in museums. And these are conversations that corrected and augmented the work of those white scholars. The conversations took various forms. They were, in some cases, vast scholarly works, for instance, by George W. Williams, W.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, and Leo Hansberry. The conversations took the form of written correspondences and personal interactions in the cases of Booker T. Washington, W.B. Du Bois, and Alain Locke. There were newspaper editorials written by Marcus Garvey and Amy Jacques Garvey. And in the case of Pauline Hopkins, it's a novel. Pauline Hopkins wrote a novel that draws on historical sources to make arguments about the Africanness of the ancient Nile River Valley cultures. So, for example, one of her characters is Professor Stone, an archaeologist who's leading an expedition to the site of Merowe, which is in modern Sudan. And Professor Stone is talking to the people on his expedition, and he's explaining to him how in their day, which is early 1900s, that when he argues through his scholarship that there's a connection between the ancient cultures of Egypt and Sudan, he's bitterly condemned by others. But he says the evidence is with the Ethiopians. So that's where I drew my title for my talk today. The evidence is with the Ethiopians, because with that line, Pauline Hopkins is correcting the incorrect argument that was found in some historical sources that the cultures of Egypt and Sudan were unrelated, and that ancient Egyptian culture was not an African culture. So let's dig a little deeper on a different piece of evidence. Since our panel today is sponsored by an art history department, I have an art history example for you. So this drawing appeared on the cover of the March 1911 issue of The Crisis. The Crisis is the magazine of the NAACP. In 1911, the editor of The Crisis was W.B. Du Bois. The line drawing is of a king named Nebmat-Re Amani Ten Mamida. The drawing is labeled an Egyptian portrait, one of the Black kings of the Upper Nile, builder of pyramid number 17. Now, an art historian who has studied the various types of art that appeared in The Crisis over time spent some time on this particular line drawing and has accused The Crisis of publishing a fabrication. The art historian claimed that an artist, an unknown, unnamed artist, has taken liberties with this sketch, altering the king's nose and lips to give them a quote-unquote fuller look to correspond with the magazine's repeated assertions that ancient Egyptian culture was associated with Africa. But scholars of the Nile River Valley know there was no manipulation of this image. This is a Meroitic king, a king from Merowe, not Egyptian. The image comes straight from Lepsius's Denkmaler. Now, Karl Richard Lepsius led a Prussian expedition to Egypt and Sudan between 1842 and 1845. This expedition scientifically studied and recorded the art and text on the walls of monuments up and down the Nile in Egypt and in Sudan. The result of their work is a 6-volume publication that we call Denkmaler for short. The full title in English is Monuments of Egypt and Ethiopia. So this drawing came to Du Bois from Lepsius's publication through a third publication, a book called The Egyptian Sudan, that was published by Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge. So you see what's happening. An art historian has accused an unknown artist of a falsification. But as editor of The Crisis, Du Bois would have ultimately been responsible for that fabrication had it existed. Art history today continues a tradition of accusing a person of African descent, in this case Du Bois, of a falsification, of claiming that there was a need to falsify visual evidence to support a claim that the ancient Egyptian culture was associated with Africa. But there was no falsification of visual evidence. There was no shadowy artist who changed the drawing. There was no need for that. This is scientific evidence, and Du Bois used it to support his argument. But the story doesn't end there. So these blocks that Lepsius's expedition copied in this form were removed from Merowe by the expedition, and they reside today in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, where perhaps Du Bois even saw them in person when he was in Berlin in the 1890s as a graduate student. We learn from a description of blocks on the museum website, and I translate from the German, the relief may at first appear Egyptian, but details such as the Negroid facial features indicate an unequivocal origin from the Meroitic kingdom. So there's a lot there to unpack. First, there's the completely outdated term Negroid. This is no longer considered a scientifically accurate description. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, there was an erroneous conception that human beings were divided into 3 quote-unquote races, Negroid, Caucasoid, and Mongoloid. But that tripartite division of humans is now recognized as inaccurate. And the museum website is using this out-of-date and racializing term to create a false separation between the people of Egypt and the people of Merowe. Because in saying that the carving might appear to be Egyptian, but the quote-unquote Negroid facial features tell us otherwise, the website implies that the people of Egypt were not quote-unquote Negroid, but were something else, presumably quote-unquote Caucasoid. The use of unscientific language to divide the cultures of the Nile River Valley into black versus white was common in the 20th century. But here it is again, still in use today in the 21st century on a major museum website. The issues and language that scholars of African descent fought against continues to be repeated today in Egyptology. We must correct unscientific language and ideas that are still present in Egyptology and Nubiology. That language is inaccurate. It reaffirms the racist structures of our discipline's histories. It ignores the current scientific understanding that race is a social construct. It shows a lack of awareness of the history of partitioning ancient Egyptian culture away from Africa. And it shows a lack of awareness of the exclusion of people of African descent from the writings of these histories. Because that's what these scholars did. They corrected the histories that were written and perpetrated by white Egyptologists. They fought against dehumanizing claims that said there was no history of Africa. And they found in the ancient cultures of the Nile River Valley a powerful and inspiring history for people of African descent.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. What an interesting, wonderful talk. So we now are at our final speaker for today's panel before we open up to discussion and questions. Lisa Saladino Haney, who is currently the postdoctoral assistant curator of Egypt on the Nile at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. Previously, she served as a lecturer at the Kansas City Art Institute and University of Kansas. She has also held positions at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the Penn Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Brooklyn Museum. Dr. Haney earned her PhD in Egyptian art and archaeology at the University of Pennsylvania, where her dissertation focused on the potential for co-regency during Egypt's 12th dynasty and its possible representation in the royal statuary of that period. Her monograph, Visualizing Co-Regency, an exploration of the link between royal image and co-rule during the reign of Senwosret III and Amenemhet III, is part of the Harvard Egyptological Studies series at Brill. And so she will be talking on her paper, From Egypt to Pittsburgh, Reimagining the Walton Hall of Ancient Egypt. Thanks.
Okay, hello. While I bring my slides up, I just want to thank Jennifer and Alex for having me today. Oh, let me see, it's coming up. Oh no, okay.
Yeah, you're good.
You can see it? Okay, good. Wonderful. Yes, so I am here today to talk a little bit about how Carnegie Museum of Natural History has been working to address the issue of colonialism and related concerns regarding the ethical display of, oh shoot, I'm not at the beginning. The ethical display of human remains in its ancient Egyptian gallery, Walton Hall of Ancient Egypt. First, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the collection so you have a little bit of background. And then I want to look at some of the issues that we're actively working to address and the initial steps that we've taken in that process. I do want to say right at the outset that addressing such deep-seated concerns in a museum setting and bringing the public along on that journey is something that takes a lot of time, careful consideration, and a lot of collaboration with departments and groups both inside and outside of the institution. To orient you a bit and give you some background on the collection, Andrew Carnegie first established the museum's collection in 1896 with the acquisition of an Egyptian coffin and the mummified human remains of its owner, a 21st dynasty chantress of Amun, whose name was never filled in on her coffin. The collection currently contains nearly 5,000 items that range from the Egyptian Paleolithic through the Coptic period. The museum acquired its collection from three main sources, and you can see those listed here in the slide. Around 1,100 pieces came in through the museum's connection to the Egypt Exploration Society, an organization whose own colonialist history has been and is being addressed in a series of lectures and panels and collaborations with groups like Everyday Orientalism and Egypt's Dispersed Heritage Project. The museum also purchased around 2,800 objects from the collection of Roman Orbeliani and roughly 500 post-Pharaonic textiles that had originally been part of the collection of F.R. Martin. We've also purchased a number of additional objects and received various gifts from patrons and donors over the years. To situate us a little bit more in our current timeline, while the museum was closed due to COVID-19, the murder of George Floyd occurred on May 25th, 2020. Over the next couple of days, Carnegie Museum of Natural History and its parent organization, Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh, each released a statement in support of Black Lives Matter. And you're looking at a small excerpt from Carnegie Museum of Natural History's statement here. These statements further amplified ongoing internal work aimed at examining colonialism, particularly in the museum's cultural halls, which include Walton Hall of Ancient Egypt. In order to begin the process of bringing action to our public statements, a small task force was formed to look at and address some of the immediate problem areas in our cultural halls prior to the reopening of the museum at the end of June. In the case of Walton Hall, the issues at hand included addressing colonialism in our collection, in how the museum acquired that collection, and in the field of Egyptology itself. We also wanted to discuss the presence of Egyptian human remains in the gallery. As you might imagine, it is very difficult to find a way to engage visitors on topics of this magnitude in a period of about 2 weeks, which is what we had here, on a very limited budget and with limited options for gallery intervention. Luckily, in the case of Walton Hall, we are actively planning a reimagining of the gallery in which all of the concerns we have identified will be able to be addressed more directly. So we decided that with transparency in mind, the most efficient solution for us to be able to move forward was to provide our visitors with more information on these problems, to be transparent about our plans to address them more fully as we move forward, and to provide them also with an initial space to be able to make their own voices heard. So first, what we did was create some signage that could be put up in Walton Hall. The first sign, which you see here, appears directly opposite visitors as they enter the hall. It addresses 3 main goals: for visitors to recognize that all the artifacts present in the gallery were made by ancient Egyptians, for visitors to acknowledge the difficult history that led to the museum's stewardship of ancient Egyptian material culture, and for visitors to feel respected and included in discussions of unjust systems and histories. And in the case of the last goal, it's not necessarily a goal of the sign itself, but for other interpretation and engagement generally going on in the galleries. You can see here that the sign briefly addresses 4 main categories of information: who made these objects, how did they get here, the field of Egyptology itself, and what's next. The sign also includes a QR code that links visitors to a survey that asks them about the sign and some of the issues related to it. In addition to our visitor goals, we hope to use the sign as a tool to show visitors where we're planning to go with the new exhibition, and also to get feedback on what areas we really need to focus in on for programming and engagement, so that we can be sure our visitors are able to follow us along on this journey. I think it can be really confusing for visitors when museums kind of abruptly change or seem to abruptly change their thinking or their modes of presentation. When they see exhibits and displays, visitors assume that what they're seeing is true and is an accurate representation of whatever theme or subject is being presented. I personally feel that it is our responsibility to use radical transparency to explain why past exhibition practices and techniques have not provided visitors with the full story. It is my hope that in planting this seed now and engaging with visitors and outside focus groups as we move forward in planning, that we will be able to open up new ways of thinking about this material that people can apply to other areas of their lives as well. The second sign appears just before a case displaying the naturally preserved human remains of a pre-dynastic man. The goals for this sign were for visitors to feel that the museum values and respects the individuals whose cultures and remains they care for, and for them to understand that they are seeing the remains of a once living human being. This sign also provides a link for people to provide feedback via an online survey. And in the case of this sign in particular, once we decide our final layout for the new gallery, we will most likely be altering and updating this sign in order to continue our process of transparency and to prepare visitors for what may be happening as we move forward with the reinstallation. The final piece of this initial phase was the creation of a longer statement that our community members can read online that addresses these issues in more detail. This statement appears when you visit the webpage for Walton Hall. It addresses the main sources of our collection and touches on the concepts of Orientalism and colonialism and how they relate to the field of Egyptology. The final sentence reads, "While this statement serves merely as an acknowledgement of these facts, we are actively examining how to better address these issues and work towards a more inclusive and honest interpretation of this gallery in its upcoming renovation." So kind of to summarize a little bit, as I've stated throughout this talk, the signs, the survey, the online statement, these were all designed as really short-term interventions that could just get an important conversation started with our team members in the museum and with our visitors as well. And we're hoping that these conversations will lead to a much more thoughtful and inclusive reinterpretation of this gallery. These are the first step in a long-term plan for engagement on important ethical and social justice issues throughout the museum as well, not just in relation to ancient Egypt. Because of the time frame that we had to take these initial steps was really so limited. We're really working hard now to expand our thinking and our strategies for engagement and to diversify the voices at the table as we move forward on this project. Thankfully, we are still in the planning stages, which offers us freedom that many other museums don't really have to come to terms with the most current thinking and strategies for engaging with issues like colonialism, Orientalism, and the display of human remains. We also plan to utilize the museum's scientific specimens to showcase the close relationship between humans and nature in the Nile Valley, and to highlight the role of the natural environment of northeastern Africa in the settlement of the Nile Valley. Unfortunately, I can't really say more about our future plans just yet, but I'm really thankful to have had this opportunity to share some of the things we're working on and to hopefully get some questions and feedback from you all as well. And just before I end things, I want to share again the URL that Elizabeth told you about in the first presentation. Here, you can find a document that has relevant readings, websites and events, videos of talks, and also places that you can donate and join. And you can see those places here: the American Sudanese Archaeological Research Center, Black Trowel Collective, the Sportula, which is micro grants for classic students, and also the Black Scholars Initiative. So I really encourage you to take the time to visit that page and also to provide us with any additional feedback or sources you think should be added to the list.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was a wonderful panel. I think we have about 20 minutes or so to have a discussion and to also welcome questions from the audience. So if you're in the audience and you have a question for one of our panelists, you're welcome to type out that question in the chat box. And I think as we decided, the panelists will raise their hand physically if they want to talk, so that we're not accidentally talking over each other, of course. But yeah, I think this is we obviously have so much work to do, right? To sort of rethink things and decontextualize this field. And I think, just starting this conversation is a really good start. And it's been very heartening to see that there have been more lectures and panels that are covering this topic. One thing that I thought was really nice that sort of ties what Lisa and Elizabeth were saying was involving the community. And it's just a reminder that, when we talk about involving the community, that can mean so many things. We can be talking about looking at an archaeological site and talking to the people who live there. And I think we do sometimes forget that people are living near many of these archaeological sites. And then, what museums often do, and in the United States, we're trying to initiate conversations with the community. So I just wanted to actually, unless there's questions in the chat right now, I think there are actually. So Lisa, you have a question from Jen Thumb. So could you say a bit more about the survey visitors the survey that they take with regard to human remains in the gallery? What questions and issues are you asking them to weigh in on?
Yeah, so right now the survey is just kind of asking for general feedback. We do have some new questions that are going to be going up in the next week or so. And so the questions regarding specifically human remains are not trying to get visitors' opinion on whether or not human remains should be displayed or how they feel about that. Mostly it's trying to get their feedback on the signage itself. So did they understand that what they were viewing were the remains of once living human beings? And then there's a scale that they can choose their response. And also just getting some kind of more general feedback. Our hope is that our intention is not to use the visitor feedback in our decision-making process, but to use it to think about how we want to engage with people and what things they may not be understanding and may be confused about. For example, I know that the naturally preserved pre-dynastic remains that are on view, many visitors and even other people who work at the museum do not think that they are a real person. And so information like that is really important for us to have so we can understand how to engage appropriately with visitors and what information they need in order to kind of be brought up to the current thinking on these things. And we also in the future will be using, as I said, that particular sign and survey to move visitors along on our journey in looking at the ethical display of human remains and what that will mean for the reinstallation of Walton Hall.
I think that's a really good point. We have another question, but I also just want to say that when lots of people visit museums, and especially younger kids who end up going to a museum like a natural history museum, this sort of thing becomes ingrained in their memories, and they get certain ideas about what they see, and so that anytime there's anything problematic, it's harder to untangle that layer. So it's always nice to have didactics that can address that. Things that I wish maybe that I had growing up. Lisa, you have another question for me from Thomas Greiner. Are there or have there been any recent consultations with the recent Egyptian community or the Sudanese community?
So I actually just got started with this project at the museum in May. In the initial phases of the project, the local Egyptian community members were consulted with. There's actually a really thriving Coptic Egyptian community in Pittsburgh. And so we do plan to do kind of external outreach and consultation as we move forward. We're kind of still in the kind of end stages of our conceptual phase. But yes, initially before I came, community outreach was done with local community groups, and we do plan to extend that type of outreach outside of our local Pittsburgh community as well. We do want to make sure that we're kind of speaking with, engaging with not just the visitorship of the museum, but outside communities who we would like to be more involved and more present in the museum as well.
We have a three-pronged question that's going to a number of people. So the first question, or if I'm getting this right, is addressed to Lisa and then Solange about the field of Egyptology. So whoever wants to go first you can decide between you. Based on your presentation, don't you think that we need to rename it because of the geography of the civilization? I think that's why. And then also for Vanessa, for the alternative, do we also need to address the alternative scholarship and anthropology of the region? So I guess overall, and maybe to all of you, why do we call it Egyptology, not Nubian Studies for Nile Valley Antiquity? And these are great presentations, by the way.
I can take a crack at that. Oops, forgot to raise my hand. Yeah, I think renaming the discipline would be a really powerful and important shift. At this point, within academia, it's not even, well, it is called Egyptology, but our departments are almost always housed within Near Eastern languages and civilizations. That's the case at University of Chicago, where I got my degree. And that to me is deeply problematic, right? We're not making a reference to the Nile Valley at all, but placing the study of Egypt, solely Egypt, within a Mediterranean or Near Eastern context. And while there are really important links between ancient Egypt and the Near East and the Mediterranean, there are even more powerful and potent ancient connections south into Africa, as Stuart Tyson Smith really spoke to recently in his lecture. And so renaming the discipline would be an amazing way to reposition Egyptology. Something like Nile Valley Studies or Northeast African Studies would allow for a broader field of exploration. And that, I think, will allow us to answer these puzzling questions that keep coming up in Egyptology. As a language person, I see that in the study of the ancient Egyptian language, words that we just don't understand. And I think that they are connected to languages elsewhere in Africa.
And I can also speak to the connections to anthropological work. Yeah, I'm currently in an anthropology department. That's what my undergrad work was based in. And similarly, the types of questions and approaches and connections that you can make by taking kind of more broader disciplinary look are very, very important. And also, Salim, I see your message about Africana studies being involved and having called this Nile Valley Studies for a very long time too. So the more connections that we can make by breaking out of a closely defined disciplinary approach just through Egyptology, I think are very important.
Yeah, I just wanted to say what Elizabeth just said, that Salim Faraji made a comment in the chat pointing out that there are people and disciplines and institutions that already refer to the study of these ancient cultures in that way. And I think that Egyptology programs, Nubiology programs could follow their lead on this, and it would be a wonderful thing for everyone. And to have more of a connection between programs currently known as Egyptology programs and Africana studies, African American studies, that would be fantastic. That is something I am actively working to try to promote.
Yeah, so there's also another comment in here, which I think is a really, something that's really interesting to think about. Basically, how the colleagues that we may have in continental Egypt, the conversations that are coming about rethinking Egyptology are disconnected from the reality of the politics of archaeology, the field, and they seem to be tied to American politics. So Catherine Bloen would like to know what each of your thoughts are on this. If anyone has, Lisa, do you have your hand up? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sorry. Yeah, I totally understand the comment, and I'm not really sure what I can offer as an explanation to that. All I can say is that I I'm learning new things too myself. This was a new project for me, and so I think one of the really interesting things about this time, and one of the neat things that all of these different Zoom talks and lectures and digital events have offered, is the ability to learn things from new people and to interact with different scholars and different scholarship than maybe you would have been able to in a more traditional setting. And so I know that that for me has opened up so many different pathways and links to scholarship and articles and different new things to read and new ways to think and think about things. And so that's kind of the perspective that I'm trying to come to this from, and just hoping to learn as much as I can and to start to be able to think about things in a new way, and to potentially in my museum role to be able to offer that same type of opportunity to other people who maybe didn't have access to the right kind of information before, or didn't know where to look, or maybe honestly had been reading information that was from a very colonialist or racist viewpoint and maybe didn't realize that. So I just kind of look at it as I am on my own personal journey, and I hope to be able to share that journey with others and maybe get them started on their own quest for knowledge.
Go ahead, Vanessa.
So, first of all, I don't see this as only tied to America. The example I gave you of the Egyptian Museum in Berlin is just one of many that that I could pull up, that I am pulling up in my research, that involve places outside of America. And I don't think, I don't accept the statement that this is tied to politics in any way. I mean, again, the example I gave, we're talking about bad science that was discredited, that the scientific community doesn't stand by. And scholars need to stop using out-of-date racist terminology. That's not a matter of politics, that's a matter of science. There is also an attendant issue, which is one of dehumanization. And that is what was going on in the arguments that were made, that were saying there was no history of Africa. That's dehumanizing. So that is a human issue, it's not a political issue. So that's why I don't accept statements like that one.
Yes, Solange.
So I've been messaging back and forth with Catherine in the chat box to make sure I understand correctly, but I also feel like I have a slightly different take on this. As somebody who's studied at a university where there wasn't a lot of teaching or knowledge about ancient Nubia among the staff, even though Chicago had done a lot of excavation in Nubia, I found that a lot of the self-teaching that I did was reading European scholars who in many ways seemed to be more forward-thinking in focusing on and researching Nubia and talking about pre-dynastic climate change and the cultural assemblages that came with living in the Green Sahara. And so I, in my current understanding, I'm just finding that I lean very heavily on prior European scholarship. So I'll just put that out there.
Would you like to respond, Elizabeth?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, from Sudanese archaeology, what's interesting too is there was an influx of researchers who didn't come from Egyptology in the 60s and the 70s with the UNESCO campaign to save monuments from the Aswan High Dam building. So like Charles Bonnet, who I mentioned, I don't think he's ever worked in Egypt. And there's many other archaeologists too that came to Sudan from working, especially in Europe, but also I think there's some Southwestern archaeology specialists from America who came during that time too. So there was an influx of people from a lot of different geographical regions themselves and their expertise and methodologies too. So I think that really helped set kind of a different tone or a type of collaboration in Sudanese archaeology. And then for me, starting a new project there, I went through a process of discussion with the Sudanese representatives and the National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums to make sure that the project that I was interested in fit with their priorities in terms of preservation and kind of cultural heritage management there. So I think there's a good platform for these discussions and collaboration. But again, it's the way that archaeology is managed is different in different between any state you'd be working on or working with along the Nile Valley.
Yeah, I just want to also add that, I think one thing that would be really beneficial to make it perhaps seem less of a political thing is to even just have the simple offering of classes that are about ancient Nubia or that include Nubia. I mean, I myself, I don't think I've never taken a class just on Nubia. I know that my advisor was a specialist in Nubian archaeology, David O'Connor. So I learned a lot about Nubia through him, but it was still a lot about Nubia from the perspective of Egypt. And I think it would just the simple thing of introducing Nubia as an entity, even in a survey class, would make a huge difference and would maybe start to pave the way to creating actual, singular classes where people will develop the classes for that. But yeah, that's what I try to do. Whenever I teach ancient Egyptian art for my survey classes here at FIT, where I maybe only have like one session with them, I always make sure to include Nubia in the discussion, and to try to also explain that it's sort of weird that we include it in this discussion of Western art, because it is included always in these Western art surveys. And I, even though, as Stuart Tyson Smith mentioned, there's more connections between Egypt and the rest of Africa than there is with, the Near East, and then much, much later with Greece and Rome. But I don't know if anyone had any thoughts about that, because I think it really does need to start with even just undergraduate classes and how we structure those. Thank you, Deb. That's one of my students. Yeah, I don't know if anyone has any listening questions.
I can say too, it's interesting disciplinarily because ancient Nubia has been a subset of Egyptology. Like for myself, going through a Near Eastern Studies PhD program, I can read Ramesside, hieratic, handwriting. I don't need to know how to do that at all for the type of research I do. It surprises me when I realize I actually remember still how to do that. So again, it's kind of these like historical legacies of how the academic study was set up, and we kind of lived through that as a scholar, and still go through the motions and the hurdles of learning hieratic. I enjoyed it. I don't need to know it at all. So yeah, I think again, acknowledging the diversity of what can come into Egyptology, and building that into how it's taught and what the emphases are. And then it opens up the next generation of scholars to the types of research that they could do and the types of questions that they should be asking.
All right, I would like to say a few words, perhaps, of a thank you to all of the participants, to the speakers also, Solange, Vanessa, Elizabeth, Lisa, and my co-host, Jen. I didn't say anything, and I think we are going to, at least at one point, move forward that this is an entire gender only woman on this panel. So, I mean, really, this is something in these last 100 years that has improved. So thank you everyone for participating in this event. I also have a quick link to one book that I now actually use very often in my courses when I teach on Africa. Female Monarchs and Merchant Queens in Africa just came out a few weeks ago, and I have the link here also. It's a fantastic book also about how the wider history of Africa can also be more integrated in this. I want to thank Jen very much really for hosting and organizing, and ARCE New York also for being assistant. I want to apologize again for everyone for the technical glitches at the very beginning. So the event has been recorded. We will make it available also as soon as possible, and we will share the link with you. And Jen, if you want to say a few words, maybe at the end too.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just basically thank you to everybody. Thank you to the Department of Art History at FIT for supporting us in hosting this really interesting, wonderful panel. Thank you again to ARCE New York for their support as well, and for their really strong interest. Thank you to all of you who came to this virtual panel. I mean, without you, this wouldn't have been such a rich discussion, and we really do want to make it a discussion. It's one thing to listen to lectures, which is very helpful and useful, but it's also another to really get together and to question each other and to hold each other accountable and to, you know, just start the conversation for real. And finally, a big thank you to the panelists. We obviously couldn't do this without you. Thank you for sharing your work and your ideas. And again, thank you all for being patient as we maneuver these events in a COVID world. But we hope to do more events like this. So we'll be in touch for sure.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.